welcome to the new season of In Conservation, the podcast for the Wildlife Trust for Beds, Cams and North Ants. I'm your host, Sophie Baker, and I'm also the editor of our members magazine, Local Wildlife, and I'm delighted to have you here. I love hearing about positive stories from across our conservation movement, and we've got a great set of episodes planned for 2026. I hope you'll join me each month to get an insight into the amazing work that's going on and the difference it's making for wildlife, wild places and people in our 3 counties and beyond. For the first episode of our new season, we're marking International Women's Day on the 8th of March with a fascinating conversation about women in conservation with our Chair of Trustees, Hilary Allison. Hilary has worked in conservation for many years, much of it in positions of leadership, and has a personal interest in the history of women working in this field. She joined me at our HQ in Camborne to introduce me to, and celebrate, some of the fascinating characters she's been researching, and to discuss what their stories can tell us about the need for all kinds of diversity, determination, and sheer, joyful, bloody-mindedness in the conservation movement today. So we're here to talk about women in conservation, and I'm really interested in this, in the kind of historical context and contemporary context, and I come from a background of working in women in publishing, actually, so a kind of literary background. So it really interests me, the kind of about how women cut through into the history and how we know about them or don't know about them. And I know you've got a presentation, haven't you? You're interested in this subject yourself.
Definitely, yes. I've long had an interest in biography. That's one of my sort of reading things when I'm sort of by myself and looking for holiday reading. I always like a really good chunky biography. And then having also worked in nature conservation for the last 40 years in various capacities, it was kind of a natural thing to bring both of these together. And then you kind of add the third layer, which is kind of looking at women's biographies and trying to understand how women have played a role in conservation. There wasn't really actually very much information out there. There's lots of individual standout examples, really exceptional women. But then I thought, well, what's the bigger picture? What has been the overall contribution of women? And that's where my kind of research and kind of interest has sort of focused, really, just trying to actually understand not just the sort of the standout people, but the people who actually we don't know much about. And there are a lot of women out there who have contributed in various ways to conservation, but I'm sure as we'll talk about as we go on, a lot of them have been really hidden, and they've come up against huge barriers, or the way that they've contributed to conservation hasn't been recorded or recognised. So it's a fascinating subject, and I'm just kind of buying books left, right, and centre at the moment. Almost every day, the postman comes and there's a new volume of biography. Then my husband goes, "Oh no, another one." So he's kind of got a bit obsessive at the moment.
Yeah, no, that's great though. So but that sounds promising. Does that mean that that if there's lots of new books coming out, is that what you mean? So there is sort of more research and more stuff, or is it your own research that's kind of drawing you to things that already exist?
There's a lot of individual interesting biographies out there, but a lot of them are books that were published, quite a few years ago. A lot of them are definitely not in the bestsellers list. You really have to dig around to find them, but they are there if you look. Yes. Mm. So my name is Hilary Allison. Currently, I'm the chair of the Council of Trustees for the Wildlife Trust, which is a huge pleasure and an honour. I currently sort of freelance, sort of self-employed, just doing a little bit here and there. I'm just finishing my term as a forestry commissioner on the board of the England's government forest agency. But for many years, I worked for the Woodland Trust, working on advocacy and policy, and then I also worked for the National Trust briefly, and also for an international body called the World Conservation Monitoring Centre, based in Cambridge. So I've been around and spent a long time sort of working in the conservation sector in various capacities, mainly advocacy and communications.
Yeah. And I'm sure have encountered lots of women in conservation yourself, in a contemporary sense.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I've worked for some amazing women in conservation, and I've come across some amazing women in conservation. I mean, for instance, Sue Holden at the Woodland Trust for many years, and then Becky Spate, who took over from her. I've worked internationally. I've seen amazing women like Inga Anderson, who is the head, the executive director of the UN Environment Programme. And even in our own government, we've got some amazing women like Mary Cray, the Environment Minister. So there are some great role models out there and some amazing women who have made it to the top of their game and their profession and who are making a real impact.
Yeah. And in comparison to the kind of historical sort of women in conservation that you're interested in, do you see an increase? I mean, do you get a sense that there are more women now kind of around at the leadership level or just in general?
Yes. It's interesting that there's certainly when I started out back in the 1980s, there were a lot of women working in conservation. I think it's always been a sector where women have been welcomed and their sort of propensity to sort of study biological sciences versus the sort of the physical sciences has meant that they've been able to find jobs, sort of ecology, land management and so on. So there's always been, I think, a good representation of women. I was trying to find some data about it, and there was some interesting surveys done back in about 2019 that said that probably about half the women working in conservation in the UK, half the people working in conservation in the UK are women. But probably, and even on the sort of senior management teams, that's approaching half. But in terms of chief executives of wildlife trusts, it's only about a quarter of them are women. So you can immediately see that the very top sort of levels of leadership are still, for a variety of reasons, and we don't really know fully what they are. I mean, one can hazard some guesses. But anyway, about a quarter, I think, are women. I think in Britain we do actually pretty well compared with what's going on on the international scene. There's some really interesting sort of figures that the World Wildlife Fund produced. They had a gender and conservation report in 2020, and that showed that actually women only make up about less than 30% of global conservation professionals. And UNEP did another report about women in leadership positions on environmental governing boards, and it was only less than 20%. So I think probably we do quite well in the UK, but obviously no room for complacency.
No, absolutely not. Progress has to keep going, doesn't it?
It does.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And so how do you feel that what can we learn from our kind of mothers? I was going to say forefathers, but of course that's not right, is it?
Yes.
Our foremothers, is that a thing? There are characters, aren't there, that come through from kind of the history of women in conservation.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the big takeaway for me has been that women who have succeeded and have made a mark in the sort of history of studying nature and of nature conservation have been incredibly determined. They've let nothing get in their way. They've absolutely focused on their objective and gone for it. And that hasn't always made them popular because things like being assertive and focused are kind of often seen as a very positive in a kind of male context and male behavioral context. But when it's a woman that does that sort of has those kind of characteristics, it's sometimes they're seen as a bit difficult or a bit challenging or a bit arsey, a bit fun. I say that.
Yes. Please, yes.
So I think that's what's distinguished a lot of the women that I've been reading about. They've often had a midlife crisis or some sort of massive change in their circumstances, and they've just seen doing something different and as a kind of release and a liberation for them to throw off sort of shackles of conventionality, whether it was sort of Victorian conventionality or even what was expected in terms of behaviour back in the 17th or 18th century. So it's like, wow, these women they've gone for it. They'd be absolutely resolute. There's a wonderful quote that I found of a woman conservationist in the United States, and she was she actually started worrying about conservation in her 50s after she'd kind of sort of finished being a suffragist, an advocate for suffrage in the US. So in the sort of 1920s, 1930s, when she was well in her 50s, a lady called Rosalie Edge, and she kind of just went for it. She kind of found out that nature conservation and the protection of birds was just not being adequately done by the existing institutions in the States, the National Park Service, the Audubon Society, which is meant to be the kind of one of the key conservation bodies over there. And she just tore into them left, right and centre with all these vitriolic pamphlets. And she spent the rest of her life campaigning to improve the way national parks were managed, to expand the national parks network, to protect the ones that were already there from illegal logging and deforestation. And the New Yorker called her, I love this quote, they said, she's the only honest, unselfish, indomitable hellcat in the history of conservation, which I think is an amazing way of describing this indomitable woman who just carried on campaigning. She just had no respect for anybody who disagreed with her. She just went for it.
Wow, to be called a hellcat, that's an ambition, isn't it?
It's good. I love that quote.
Yeah. What's another one of your favourites then? In this idea of sort of determined women.
Well, yeah, there are so many of them, really. I mean, I think some of the ones that I've been so impressed with are the kind of some of the 19th century naturalists, the women who went off and did plant collecting, plant hunting, butterfly collecting, because they just broke the mold. I mean, there's an amazing woman called Margaret Fountain who was born into a very kind of traditional family, and she had a kind of very well-to-do upbringing, and basically after she had a disastrous infatuation which went completely wrong with this chorister from Norwich Cathedral, she took up her kind of childhood pastime of collecting butterflies and just went with it with a vengeance. And she spent 40 years going off around the world collecting butterflies, discovering new species, informing collections and so on. And she's interesting partly because of what she did in terms of lepidoptery, but her diaries were released and unsealed after 100 years after her birth in Norwich in the 1980s. And they caused an absolute outrage because it kind of gave a real glint into her personal life as well as her natural history life. So I won't say too much about that because it might spoil the surprise for anybody wanting to go and read them. But she was amazing. I think there's another woman who's completely bonkers. It was an American lady called Martha Maxwell. And she grew up in America in the sort of mid-19th century. But she had a very early love of nature. And her view about getting people to understand why nature was important and the importance of protecting it and kind of educating people about nature was actually taxidermy. She went out and she was a brilliant shot, and she actually went out into the Colorado mountains and shot a specimen of every single mammal and bird that she could find. And then because her taxidermy actually got really quite well known, she was then asked by the Colorado state government to contribute to the American Centennial Exhibition, and each state made a contribution. And Colorado asked her to send this massive diorama of over 200 different taxidermied specimens of the best of Colorado's wildlife to this exhibition. And she thought that this was the best way to educate people, because you imagine back in the late 19th century, there was no television, photography was still in its infancy. The only way a lot of people could actually get up personal and close to these animals was actually through approaching a stuffed specimen.
Yeah.
But she did these amazing kind of dioramas where the animals were actually set against sort of backdrops of the habitat that they would have lived in.
Oh, right. So kind of very naturalistic.
So she was trying to kind of place them not just as sort of interesting specimens, but in the sort of wider ecological context of their habitats.
Yeah, wow, and not something you'd see a lot of today, is it?
No,
I mean, what a different world we live in.
Absolutely, I think that kind of approach to conservation education is probably kind of no longer valid. But you think about it, you go to the Natural History Museum now, or any natural history museum in any major city in Europe. What do you see? cabinets of stuffed animals. And so there is a long-lasting legacy of this, and it's often, you can actually get up really close and personal with these animals and look at them. But I think it's a bit of a kind of dead end, really.
Yeah, a little. Well, in more than one way.
Absolutely, yes. So she's definitely one of my favourites.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, there's just so many stories, aren't there? Yes. I mean, and so many of them I think are lost to time because the nature of them is that they weren't as recorded. They weren't given the same credence as their male colleagues and often partners, I think, probably if it's the same as in a lot of history. So, it feels like that these women had amazing personalities, but that's what allowed them to cut through. I mean, would you think that's how it works?
Yes, definitely. And I think the issue is the further back in history you go, the more difficult it is to actually identify those women. It's really only the women who had positions of power or some kind of authority whose actions are recorded in some way, mainly through documentation or even maybe books or whatever, that you can kind of get a little glimpse of that. I mean, there's a lovely story that I'm really keen on, which is back in Sardinia in the late 14th century, there was a wonderful woman called Eleonora of Arborea, and she was basically in charge of one of the 4 independent kingdoms on Sardinia at that time. And she ended up being really keen to protect the falcons that were in Sardinia at the time, because they were much sought after by people around Europe for hunting, for falconry. And so we've got written evidence of the fact that she passed laws to stop people from disturbing the nests of falcons and taking the young chicks away. So she's actually probably produced what's the first recorded evidence of wildlife conservation legislation. I mean, which is really cool. And she also did quite a few laws about forest management and protecting forests. So she's really kind of ace legislator, I think. I mean, she's really cool.
When was that in history?
That was about the end of the 14th century, so 1390s, that kind of thing.
That's extraordinary, isn't it? Yeah, that's much further back than my imagination was kind of heading there.
I mean, she's an unusual example, but I really like that. So if you're a birder, you probably have heard of Eleonora's falcon, which is a Mediterranean falcon that you can go and see today. It's still around. And I mean, the falcon itself is actually, sorry, it's a bit of a sideline, but and the falcon's a bit of a strange and unusual bird because it actually captures young songbirds live, and then it thrusts them in the crevices of the rock and keeps them there as a kind of live larder.
Oh my gosh.
So, I mean, the bird that she's now given her name to is actually quite an interesting bird in its own right.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing.
But she helped protect it, which is the main thing.
Yes, absolutely. So that it's still there for us to enjoy and experience today. Yeah. Have you come across any women who made a real difference, but who were kind of then forgotten, or who were kind of sidelined and have come to the fore again?
Yes, I think there are a lot, and I'm finding more and more as I read more and more around the subject. One example for it is a lady called Birute Goldikas. I bet you've never heard of her.
No.
But you'll have heard of Jane Goodall and you'll have heard of Dian Fossey.
Yes.
Now, the three of them, Jane, Dian and Birute, were all protégés of an amazing anthropologist called Louis Leakey, who lived in the sort of 1920s and 30s and was a very, very venerable academic in Kenya up into the 1960s. And his idea was that you could actually understand something about the origins of man through understanding the behavior of man's closest relatives, or humankind's closest relatives, the great apes. So Jane Goodall went off and looked at chimpanzees, and Dian Fossey, whose life has been made into a film, Gorillas in the Mist, went off and looked at mountain gorillas in the sort of Rwanda, Congo area. And the last one of those, the youngest of the three, is Birute Goldikas. Now, she's still alive. She's been working in Borneo for her Orangutan Foundation for 50 years. She's still there doing research, campaigning to protect the orangutans from forest destruction, rehabilitating orangutans that have been brought into the pet trade and that have been then abandoned. She's still there doing it. And you think about Jane Goodall and Dian Fossey, who are really well-known names. I mean, Dian Fossey, unfortunately, was murdered, so that's given her a little bit of notoriety. And Jane Goodall was, as we know, just passed away last year. But Birute Goldikas is still there. She's still doing stuff. She's still working. She's still totally and utterly focused on her mission. So I think she's somebody who deserves a little bit of credit. In fact, they call this group of women is sometimes called the trimates, which I think is a great way of describing you. They were all involved in primate research. So she's an amazing example who's still fortunately with us. And then I think there are probably a couple of other women who deserve a bit of a shout out. One is a lady called Pauline Dower, and she was the deputy chairman of the National Parks Commission. And in the immediate post-war period, when there was all this amazing reconstruction and kind of the UK following the war, in terms of the National Health Service and Social Security and all the rest of it, there was also the legislation that was put in place to create national parks and wildlife protection that was passed in 1949. And one of the bits of that legislation was the establishment of a national parks network in England and Wales, actually very much later than the United States. I mean, they were on it kind of 50 years before. And originally, it was the report that had set that up was and done all the sort of groundwork during the war and immediate post-war period was led by her husband, John Dower, who's quite a well-known name in conservation. But Pauline, who was equally bright and equally competent, basically took over the role that he would have played in that commission because he died in 1947. And so from late 1940s through to 1966, she was the deputy chair of the National Parks Commission and was responsible for the establishment, the setting up of the 10 national parks that were in that original group of 15, Snowdonia, Peak District, and so on, Lake District. And she was there, going to the inquiries, arguing about the boundaries, talking about the sort of governance, and talking about how these things were actually going to work. And she did that for those 10 national parks. And she's not somebody who gets a lot of credit. It's mainly her husband. In the days of when I started out in conservation anyway, the Countryside Commission's headquarters in Cheltenham was called John Dower House in his memory. It wasn't called Pauline Dower House.
No.
So she's another one I think could really do with a bit more recognition of what she did. And then the other thing, of course, is the fact that the RSPB was founded by 4 women. I mean, we know a lot about Emily Williamson, she gets the main credit, but actually she went off to do kind of other sociable and charitable causes, and she left the other 3 basically there to kind of take the RSP or the Society for Protection of Birds, as it then was, through to its early years. And there's one lady in particular whose reputation has only very recently kind of been restored through an amazing biography by a lady called Tessa Boas. And she wrote the biography of one of these 4 women called whose name was Margaretta Lemon. And
great name.
It's great. I know.
Some of these women have just the most fantastic names, don't they? I wonder if that helps.
Yeah. But what I like about Margaretta Lemon was that she was another one of these really driven people who was not concerned about popularity stakes whatsoever. In fact, there's an amazing story. When she was young, she was very concerned about, that's really how the Society for Protection of Birds originated, was to try and ban the use of of feathers from live birds in women's hats. That was the whole sort of early genesis of the SPB, or the RSPB as it became. And so as a very young woman, she used to sit in church on a Sunday and look at all the women all the hats of the women, and those that had kind of these egret feathers or ostrich feathers or whatever it might be in their hat, and sometimes even whole stuffed birds in people's hats. And she would actually make a list of all the women that had these horrendous confectionaries on their head. And then when she got home from church, she would write them all an individual letter, basically ripping them off and telling them off and explaining why they were responsible for helping the bird plumage trade and the impact that might have on extinction of species. And she did this week after week after week, and you can see why she then got involved in the RSPB. Again, this is another lovely little quote. That's a really good one. So Tessa Boas, who wrote her biography, talked about Etta Lemon as, and this is really good, the Margaret Thatcher of the bird world, visionary, forthright, divisive, but in the end, out of touch. Because basically she hung around for too long and became quite unpopular even within the RSPB. And the early phase of the RSPB was very much dominated by these four women, but then it kind of got much more sophisticated and got taken over by very competent men, of course, but though the influence of those early women kind of sort of waned, and she hung around a little bit too long, hence the sort of final comment. Yeah, so there's definitely, and I'm sure there are lots more women like those who haven't even got a biography written of them, or whose life is really unrecognised unless you start going back and digging in the archives. So.
And many more who probably never wrote diaries, or
absolutely,
whose families didn't necessarily keep anything. It's just because I think the thing about conservation, as any kind of area of work, when you start looking into it, that there is so much work to do. There are so many roles in and of and within conservation, both leadership, but also just boots on the ground of people just going out and actually doing conservation work in nature reserves, or and everything in between. It's just a huge variety of work that needs to be done.
Yes, that's very true, and I think that's another thing that's really struck me in all of the work that I've been doing, all the reading that I've been doing, is actually the huge range of contributions that women have made. You tend to when you talk about women in conservation, you tend to think about the boots on the ground and the sort of the reserve wardens and the natural history experts and the ecologists and so on. But conservation as a movement is now a huge multi-billion-pound business, and you need people of all kinds to support that. And the same is actually true of interest in natural history in the early conservation movement. They didn't just need people who knew one bird from another. They needed people who could lead the organizations. As you say, they needed people who were campaigners, who were, really skilled. You think about, Greta Thunberg. I mean, she's an amazing campaigner. She's not a naturalist. She's not. That's not what she's known for anyway. She probably is very good at identifying something. But you need campaigners. You need communicators. You need artists. You need philanthropists. You need people who think out of the box. Think about Isabella Tree and the work that she's done on rewilding. I mean, that's completely changed the way that we think about conservation today, and she and her husband Charlie Burrell have kind of between them probably made rewilding a whole new conservation philosophy. I mean, other people have contributed to it, but they've stuck at it for 20 years at NEP. So that innovation is amazing. And you think about politicians. I mentioned Mary Cray, but going back a little bit earlier to when I was a student, there was an amazing report published in the late 1980s called Our Common Future, which was done under, I think, the auspices of the UN, and it effectively defined the concept of sustainable development as we know it today. And that whole project was led by an amazing woman, the former Norwegian Prime Minister, a lady called Gro Harlem Brundtland. and people who are interested in the history of conservation have probably heard of the Brundtland Report. And she basically has helped put the concept of sustainable development on the map. So you need kind of politicians, you need campaigners, you need people who lead organisations who are good at doing that. I talked about Becky and Sue earlier on. So this variety of roles, I think, is incredibly interesting to explore, and just shows you that the qualities that women have can be deployed in all sorts of ways. Women can be leaders, they absolutely can, but they are also really skilled at understanding and managing people, which is why you often get women in senior leadership management roles within organisations like our own trust. But also you get women who are very skilled artistically. You think back to the 19th century, again, pre-photography, it was okay to be a gentlewoman and to have an accomplishment of being good at painting or drawing or illustration. That was kind of okay. You were allowed to do that. It was. Botany generally was seen as a nice pursuit for women. It was part of their so-called accomplishments.
Nice and gentle.
Nice and gentle. Nothing too difficult or strenuous. But a lot of those women artists, back in the 19th century, contributed a huge amount to public education about nature, which obviously presaged the kind of sense of environmental responsibility and awareness that nature was actually under threat, which was emerging even at the end of the 19th century.
So are there any local examples of women in conservation, sort of historical or otherwise, that you've come across?
Yes, there are actually. Yeah, the first is one of the co-founders of the National Trust, Octavia Hill. She was actually born in Wisbech in Cambridgeshire, but I don't think she had many long-term associations with it. But she's also an absolute standout. She was actually a social reformer. She wasn't necessarily an environmentalist, but she was one of the early women who really got the relationship between human health and well-being and the environment. And she undertook a whole load of housing programs supported by John Ruskin, actually. And she was very keen to make sure there was green space built into those housing developments. And so her early involvement in the National Trust was very much focusing on the countryside aspect of it rather than the historic houses, which is obviously where the trust began.
Yeah.
And the other one, of course, and probably quite well known to this trust, is Miriam Rothschild, who lived at Ashton in Northamptonshire. And she was the daughter of Charles Rothschild, who created the original list of nature reserves that back in the 1912 or so, and which also he was a co-founder of the Society for the Promotion of Nature Reserves. But she was an amazing woman in her own right. I mean, Rothschilds often are. There are some amazing biographies of them. But she was a bit of a kind of what I would call an ecological eclectic. She kind of did a bit of everything. I mean, her main passion was sort of the biology and ecology of fleas, but she also did a lot to champion sort of wildlife gardening and the re-establishment of herb-rich meadows. I mean, she persuaded Prince Charles to do that at Highgrove back in the 70s, and he put down acres and acres of pasture that, based on her advice at Highgrove, to be kind of wildflower meadows. And she also championed the creation of national nature reserves in the post-war period based on her father's own list. So she wasn't just she was an eminent ecologist in her own right, but she was also a very powerful advocate for conservation as well. So, and a complete one-off, completely eccentric, wonderful woman. Listen to podcasts of her talking. It's just inspirational.
Yeah, amazing. Should look her up. Yeah, fantastic. Was that the same organisation that then became the Wildlife Trust?
It changed its name several times, but then eventually has morphed into the Wildlife Trust movement.
Yes, yeah, amazing.
Yeah.
Do you think? I mean, it's clear that women have played a huge role in nature conservation. do you think there are still barriers? Things are better these days. I think talking about the percentages earlier, weren't we? But in terms of, the representation of women in this field, which is a very broad thing to say, as broad as it is. Do you think women still face barriers that men perhaps don't face?
Well, I don't think the barriers, and there are some, I don't think the barriers are specific to the conservation sector, personally speaking. I think there's sort of generic things like the sort of confidence to apply for and move into senior leadership roles, sort of pay gaps, getting back into your career after maternity leave, having the confidence to speak up and speak out at conferences and meetings, and just the general kind of sense of am I being listened to or am I being heard? I think all of those things I think are still relevant in terms of women in professional roles today, whether or not it's the conservation sector. I actually think the conservation sector is not bad. It's not as sort of patriarchal or as traditional as some of the sort of more vocational areas, like law or whatever it might be, dare I say. I think conservation, because it's a relatively new sector, it kind of, and the kind of employment in it expanded around the time that feminism and the sort of role that women could play in working life was generally being acknowledged. I think the two have sort of grown up together and developed. And so while women in conservation do face many barriers, I don't think they're insurmountable. But it just requires that determination, that dedication, that assertiveness, that sense of purpose, and not being fobbed off to that you absolutely have to go for it. And I wish I'd kind of realised that really early in my career, because I was, when we all set out, we were all kind of wide-eyed and, it's wonderful, I've got a job, it's great, it's so exciting, I'm earning my own money. And you don't think necessarily very much about the circumstances and the kind of culture within which you work. So that I think that's really important. People now need to be really self-aware at an early stage and kind of be flexible yet determined to achieve in the sector. And then I think the sector will allow them to be successful.
Yeah, absolutely. I've found that. I mean, as somebody who has moved to this sector from the literary world, literary charities, it certainly feels more open here. And the other thing I think that I've appreciate is the generosity of people who are above you looking down and helping, that there's the competition, sometimes it's that striving in other organizations. I've found that you're competing for things, whereas actually we're all working together. Yes. And lifting other people up lifts the whole organization up. Yes. And supporting people that are coming after you, who are earlier in their career. Yes. Is a really important, sharing skills and advice and things. I think there's a lot of that goes on in my experience.
Yes, I agree. I think that's partly to do with what conservation is all about. It's a vocation, it's a mission, it's kind of there's something bigger at stake than just your professional pride or, sort of getting advancement. It's actually, we're all working together fundamentally for a better world and for a better world for nature, a better world for people. And I think that helps. I think that mission does help in terms of encouraging women to express themselves fully. I mean, that's not to say that it's totally okay. I mean, there are some things that we could do better.
Yes, yes, always. But it's no one person's job. And it's longer than anyone's career. This mission is longer than anyone's career. So, you can't be selfish about it, can you? And that's how I feel. We're all working towards something that will keep going after us and on and on, hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who are your personal heroes, do you think? Have you mentioned them already, or is that?
No, I haven't. There's a couple who I keep going back to, mainly because their success and their impact cost them a huge amount personally. And and these names probably will be familiar to people, but I think they're familiar for a reason. I mean, Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring, which was published in 1962, I think it was, and that book completely changed the way that conservation was seen. It kind of explored the impact of pesticides on wildlife, and it made her hugely unpopular with sort of big industry in America. And she published it at a time where she wasn't actually particularly well herself. And then when the book was published, she went out and did lots of speaking tours, lots of interviews, again, while quite ill. And there was, you can argue that probably all that stress and vitriol didn't do her own sense of well-being a great deal of good. And in fact, she died of cancer in 1964. So she didn't really live to see the impact that her book had. But Rachel Carson, I think, is one of those women where if you sort of Google women in conservation, she comes up every time. But her backstory is amazing, because she was a marine scientist, realized she was a really excellent science communicator, wrote some beautiful books, including one called The Sea Around Us, which is still worth a read today. And then she got really interested in the whole business about, DDT, pesticide eggs, that kind of impact on, egg thinning and the success of, particularly birds of prey being able to raise young, and the whole way in which pesticides and DDT in particular permeated the food chain of birds, and ultimately the food chains that we rely on. So she's kind of one person that I really admire, and her book is, if people haven't read Silent Spring, you need to go and read it. It's beautifully written, and it's really well argued, and it just kind of makes you sit up and think, have we really cracked this today? A lot of chemicals are now banned and out of use, but we still know that they're there in the system. So she's still one. And then the other one is a Kenyan lady called Wangari Maathai, who, she won the Nobel Peace Prize back in the early 2000s, 2004, I think it was. And she set up something in Kenya called the Green Belt Movement, which was a women's-led movement to reforest parts of Kenya, to plant trees. It was a kind of very bottom-up democratic approach to trying to tackle environmental degradation. And she kind of made the connection, which is the thing I really admire her for. She made the connection between the sort of environmental degradation, women's livelihoods, local democracy, environmental and social justice, in a way that nobody had really done before. And she also suffered a lot of, physical abuse during the sort of early 90s in Kenya, when Daniel Arap Moi was the president, and she was arrested and she was beaten up. She was in hospital. She was really hassled, lots of death threats and so on. But she was incredibly courageous. She wouldn't she wouldn't stand down. She wouldn't stop speaking out, campaigning against the appropriation of public forests by the Kenyan government. They're building on sort of parks in the center of Nairobi, for commercial gain when there wasn't really much reason to do so. And she really made people in Kenya feel uncomfortable. Luckily, after the change of government, she was sort of reinstated, and her reputation was restored. In fact, she even became a Minister for Environment in the Kenyan government for a few years, although her transition from campaigner to politician wasn't entirely successful. She didn't really kind of cut the mustard on that. But she kind of really helped to develop this idea about conservation being a women's agenda, and that the impacts of environmental degradation on women were particularly profound, because women were the people who were growing the food, collecting the water, collecting the firewood. Without the forests and the kind of healthy soils as the basis of the environment, that was becoming increasingly difficult and challenging. So that's really why I love Wangari Maathai. She died in 2010, I think it was, 2011. At quite a young age. She was only 70, I think. But, I mean, she's just such a legend. And there is a Wangari Maathai Day every year in which the Kenyans celebrate.
Yeah.
So both of them, I think, they suffered. They literally suffered for their cause. So that's why they're particular heroes of mine.
Yeah. And were they heroes before you got into this area of work?
Yes, they were.
Helped inspire.
Yeah, Wangari Maathai in particular.
Yeah.
In fact, back in the early 2000s when I worked at the Woodland Trust, we were organising a big conference on woodland creation and woodland expansion. And I actually wrote to her to see if she would come and speak. She declined. Not surprisingly, I think she had bigger fish to fry. But so she's been a hero of mine for probably 30 years. Yeah. And Rachel Carson also, her name kept popping up even when I was at school and studying at university. So, and the more I've learned about their lives in recent years, the more I think, God, what does it take? Would I have gone that far? It's quite a question to ask yourself.
It is quite a question to ask yourself, and I think, but one of the things I love about the sector is that not everybody has to be that person, woman or not.
Yes,
that you have those people. But it's interesting that you say she didn't transition particularly well from campaigner to politician, because I think actually they're very different skill sets, and you need people with different skill sets to further the agenda. You need people who are able to talk that kind of political language and to fight those political corners in a way that is different to being a campaigner who can just chain themselves to a defence, of which we need them as well. We need people who have all these variety of skills, which leads me to ask, as devil's advocate, why should we care about women in conservation? Why should we care about making it better and improving things?
Well, why not? I mean, it's basically the answer. I mean, I think, the role of women in conservation is part actually of an even bigger agenda, which is the sort of, equality, diversity, inclusion agenda.
Absolutely.
And I think without claiming special powers for women, I think, if you have a really diverse workforce with multiple viewpoints, with multiple perspectives, you're going to get fundamentally better outcomes for the environment and for the organisation than if you had a lot of, Me Too kind of cut out clones. I mean, that's basically what it boils down to. I mean, I'm not saying that, women are obviously very, very different within our our overall group. Women are not all the same, and they have different views and different ways of working and different perspectives. But if we don't embrace diversity in the workplace, I think we're on a slippery slope to single solutions, history repeating itself. I don't think that's healthy at all.
And ultimately irrelevance.
Yeah.
That's what it amounts to.
And actually, there's quite a lot of evidence that better, whatever better means, better decision making happens when you involve women, particularly around the table, in environmental decision making. There's quite a lot of academic studies that have been done on that. So, and if you step back even further, it's not so relevant in a UK context, perhaps, but certainly if you're working internationally, the impact of biodiversity loss of ecosystem services, environmental degradation on women is even more profound, particularly in subsistence economies, than it is on men. And I was fortunate enough to contribute to a report on this, which some colleagues from the International Institute for Environment and Development did this for the UK government a few years ago, and I was stunned at the outcome of this report, which looked at the impact of biodiversity loss on women. It's really profound, and it's not just the sort of direct impacts; it's all the indirect impacts. If you have women who need to go and collect firewood or go and collect non-timber forest products from the forest, foodstuffs, or collect clean water, the further they have to go
the more time it takes, and for young women in particular, that affects their schooling, it affects their sort of social status, it kind of prevents them from getting further education. There are all sorts of knock-on effects that once you actually start looking at it, you think, these are profound, So looking at it from the big helicopter picture, there's absolutely a good reason why we need to understand and encourage women to participate in conservation, both internationally, but also here in the UK.
Yeah. And do you think our trust is doing a good job at that? That's a bit of a difficult question, isn't it, potentially?
Of course we are. I'm not joking when I say that. Working with all the staff here is quite inspirational. It's been a real privilege. We're good on our trustee board. We've got a pretty good gender balance on the trustee board. There's a great good gender balance in terms of the trust staff. And there are people in very senior positions here in the trust. So I think the trust is working well because of women, because of the women on its staff, as well as the men. Sorry, Brian.
Yes, absolutely. Well, it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you. Thank you so much for all of your insights and all of these amazing characters. Thank you. And it's been really, really fantastic having you here.
It's been a pleasure talking to someone about my newfound friends.
Yes, absolutely. Brilliant.
Thank you to Hilary for her time and expertise, and for introducing us to just a few of our important hellcat and eccentric RC forebears. Given the theme of this year's International Women's Day is Inspire Inclusion, I hope that you feel inspired and energised to get involved in making our world a better place for every creature, including the human creatures that call it home. Whether that's in a career, volunteering, or offering your financial support, it's all invaluable, and we need people just like you. We're not just defending nature, we are nature defending itself. Find out how to get involved with our trust by exploring our website at wildlifebcn.org. For more information about some of the women and books that Hilary mentioned in our conversation, and to find all our previous podcast episodes, visit wildlifebcn.org/podcast. And if you have any feedback or suggestions for the podcast, I'd be delighted to hear from you, so please do get in touch. Thanks for listening. Cheerio.